So today is our third talk on the practice of the mean. The practice of the mean essentially is how to live, how to experience our innate nature in our lives today. If we are able to follow this innate nature, then we will realize our greatest potential for goodness. We will achieve our moral excellence, and we can help others achieve their moral excellence. So the practice of the mean is actually very practical. It's about how to live our lives. And in the second section, which we started last talk, it was really a series of quotes from Confucius about how to practice the mean and what are the pitfalls that we might encounter. The practice of the mean, as we can see from these quotes, is also called cultivating the way. So there are many names for the same thing, but essentially they all lead to the same idea. So Confucius here talks about how the exemplary person is able to constantly maintain the mean. In other words, they're able to constantly cultivate the way, regardless of who they interact with and regardless of the situation that they find themselves in. So it could be they could be in a difficult situation or in a favorable circumstance, but regardless, they continue to cultivate. And then Confucius talked about why is it that the petty person cannot cultivate? Some people who think they're wise will try to overinterpret things, and the foolish don't even bother learning. Because their knowledge is inadequate, then they cannot practice. Similarly, the worthy will practice, but they might over-practice, go beyond it, and the unworthy may not fall short of the mark. And so the worthy and unworthy refers to the practice of the mean. And because their practice is inadequate, their knowledge is also inadequate. So there's a delicate balance between knowledge and practice. And so today we begin our talk by examining how King Shun was able to practice the mean. King Shun was considered an exemplary ruler and also a sage. So let's look at how he does it. So here Confucius said, Shun had great wisdom, did he not? Shun loved to ask questions, and he loved to examine familiar words. He accentuated the good instead of the bad. He grasped these two ends and used the mean in relation to the people, and this was what made him Shun. This passage is actually very well structured. So it begins with an opening sentence, a rhetorical question. Essentially, Confucius is praising Shun for his great wisdom, which is manifest in the 4 points below. In fact, you could say that these are the strategies that Shun uses in order to achieve this great wisdom. And then the passage is capped off with a concluding statement which reiterates how amazing Shun is. So King Shun, as we know, lived in the 23rd century BCE. He was also known as Yao Chonghua or Yu Shun. And some believe that this Shun was actually a posthumous name, which had two meanings. First, he accepted the abdication of King Yao and was very accomplished. And second, that he possessed humanity, rightness, and was enlightened, which is in keeping with what Confucius has said in this particular passage about his wisdom. So that's this concept that we'll turn to now. Wisdom in the practice of the mean, this text here, is pronounced as zhi. But the word, this form of the character, actually has two meanings, both knowledge and wisdom. And it was only later in history that wisdom took on its own distinct form, as you can see, and it's the one we currently use today. So from its very beginnings, knowledge and wisdom are somehow related. But how are they related? Does it mean that the more that we know, the wiser we become? Not necessarily. And how do we know that someone is wise? If I asked each and every one of you to provide a definition, I'm sure that we'd come up with very different answers. What we do need to know in this particular context is, what exactly does Confucius mean? What's the Confucius perspective of wisdom? So great wisdom is not just any ordinary wisdom, like sound judgment and knowing what to do in different situations. It's actually the practice of the mean. Being able to practice the mean is great wisdom. And in terms of the highest learning, the Daxue, great wisdom is manifesting our enlightened virtue, loving the people, and resting in utmost goodness, which means that we have to go through that process of detecting our thoughts arising, perfecting our knowledge, making intention sincere, rectifying our mind, cultivating ourself, and so on. And this is actually common to both the practice of the mean and the highest learning. It's really talking about the same processes and the same achievement of this great wisdom that is actually innate within us. So this is the great wisdom that we're talking about here. Now, what are the strategies to achieve this? Let's look at the very first point. Shun loved to ask questions. Now, when I first read this, I immediately thought, why is it that if Shun has great wisdom, why is it that he still needs to ask questions? Doesn't he know everything already? In fact, to be able to ask questions, we have to know the limits of our knowledge and understanding. In other words, we have to know what we don't know. And that, in fact, is the most important knowledge, because it's only when we know our faults and our weaknesses that we can improve. And this is well encapsulated by a sentence here from the Lao Tzu, which says, to know and yet think one does not know is the highest attainment. Not to know and yet think one knows is actually a fault. And it's really highlighting the importance of knowing our limits and not thinking that we know everything, because by overlooking our weaknesses, that is in fact our greatest Achilles heel. Now, Shun was able to do this. He had an open mind. He'd always loved to ask questions. And this was not only when he was a commoner. In fact, we read that when he succeeded King Yao, one of the first things he did was to travel to all quarters of the kingdom and meet with the local leaders. Why? Well, he wanted to know what life was for the local people. What were their needs? And this didn't just happen every 5 years. This didn't just happen once. It actually happened every 5 years. Shun also appointed a minister who had open lines of communication with all officials around the kingdom. And so there were a feedback mechanism by which Shun could check and ask questions and also receive advice from people around his kingdom. And so you can see he very much valued this ability to learn and be open-minded. But this wasn't just recorded for Shun. It's one of the sages. In fact, this particular trait was also recorded for the founders of the Zhou dynasty, the longest dynasty in Chinese history. So as it says here in the Han Dynasty text, Master Huainan says that King Wen was wise, yet loved to ask questions, and thus was sagely. King Wu was brave, yet loved to ask questions, and thus was victorious. So, father and son both loved to ask questions, but both were equally talented. And it was because they loved to ask questions that they improved and became better. Even in the Analects, we read that Confucius did the same. Every time, or when he entered the Grand Temple before the ancestral commemoration ceremonies, he asked questions about everything. Now, we know that Confucius had very broad learning in terms of the rituals. But why was it that he asked questions about everything? Well, this was because he wanted to be thorough, wanted to be careful and not assume that he already knew. Maybe things have changed. And by being cautious, by asking, it showed a reverence to the ritual and a reverence to his ancestors. So this particular skill, you could say, is a skill of highly effective people. It's one of the habits of these great sages, and it's something that we can do even today. We can learn how to ask questions, but we particularly need to know who to ask, what to ask, and how to ask. So, who to ask? We need to ask people who are more knowledgeable and experienced in the field, and not necessarily just our friends. And when we ask these people, sometimes we may not get the answer that we're hoping for. They may not tell us the answer straight away. They might tell us how to find the answer, and that is actually even more valuable. As they say, if you give someone a fish, you feed them for one day, but if you teach them how to fish, then you feed them for a lifetime. So the how questions are actually even more important, which leads us to the next part, which is what to ask. We live in this world of information overload. Information is at our fingertips. So it means that we actually don't have to be a walking encyclopedia. We have to ask questions about things that's worth knowing. So clearly, every day when we have to fulfill our responsibilities at work or in our studies, then these are the things that we have to be clear about. But more importantly, we have to be clear about how to cultivate the way, because that actually permeates every part of our lives and helps us realize our enlightened virtue, this innate virtue. So that's what we have to ask about. And then how do we ask? We have to keep an open mind, to be humble, because then that means that we're then able to be receptive and ready to listen and consider the answer. We don't just listen and take it on blind faith. We actually have to evaluate what we're being told and then be able to follow up with more questions if we don't understand. So this way of asking is very different from asking because we want to look intelligent or asking just for the sake of asking questions. Because if we do that, then actually we're not really willing to listen at all to what's being said when they answer us. And I guess as part of this, I want to particularly note how it's important to ask questions and overcome our embarrassment and shyness. I mean, I've had experiences in conferences, seminars, etc., where oftentimes someone asks a question and it's exactly the question that I had, but I was too shy to ask. And so, in fact, when we have a question, rather than feeling like it might be a silly question or it could be something that, no one wants to know, we should, in fact, think, because it is often a reality, that other people want to know the answer as well. And by asking this question, we're asking on behalf of them. We're benefiting others. And by doing that, you can actually overcome your embarrassment and shyness. And ask, because if you don't, you'll never know. So this asking questions is a very important skill that we have to master, because we're going to be learning throughout our lives. And it says here very clearly that Shun didn't just ask questions, he loved to ask questions. Now, why did they use that word of, love to ask questions? Well, because Shun realized that by asking questions, it wasn't just about improving himself, it was about improving the quality of life for the people. So by asking questions, he could benefit so many other people. That was really the primary motivation for his questioning. So it sort of goes back to what we said before, that, when we ask questions, when we gain knowledge, when we're learning, it's really not for us. It's actually because we can use that in the future to help and benefit others. So that's the first point of asking questions. The second strategy to achieve this great wisdom is to examine familiar words. Now, in Chinese, this character er means near. So it's something that's within our grasp, but more on a cognitive level rather than a physical level. It's something that's simple and easy to understand for us. So in Chinese, yan refers to common sayings and proverbs. Now, I've listed here two that have equivalents in both Western and Eastern culture, and I'm sure you would have heard of them before. The first is, you reap what you sow. Now, obviously, this is about how every thought, word, and action has consequences for the future. And so that means, of course, that we have to be very careful in what we're doing in the present moment. So that's not hard to understand. And similarly, ignore the advice of elders at our peril. So elders have walked further on the path of life, and would do well to heed their advice, because they may not repeat it. So for many people, they would say, well, that's just common sense. And in fact, this goes back to what we said before about the wise and the foolish. So by examining these familiar words, Shun, he wouldn't let these proverbs slip by without fully reflecting and understanding the depth of their meaning, and really sort of understanding the wisdom behind them, compared to normal people who would probably just think, well, I've heard that before, everyone knows what that means, and then not give it a second thought. So this would be, someone who thinks that they're wise already. They know everything. There's no point having to reflect on these very simple quotes and sayings. But as we can see here, the great Shun achieved his wisdom by examining these familiar words. In fact, when we think about all that we've talked about in the 4 books to date, if we actually boil down the teachings, some of the most profound ideas can be conveyed in the simplest sentences and the simplest ideas, the simplest ways. So by overlooking them and not examining them further, we actually lose sight of something that could actually change our lives. Take, for example, this idea of you reap what you sow. If we actually believed, if we actually realized that everything that we do now changes our future, then I'm sure that we would live our lives in a very different way. So Shun would examine these familiar words because he wanted to really take hold of these gems of wisdom. Now, the third strategy is that he would accentuate the good instead of the bad. So this relates to the previous ideas that, when he's asking questions, sometimes he might discover mistakes, people doing the wrong thing. And when he's examining these common sayings, he could find that some have negative connotations. So you have to know the difference between what's good and bad and what's right and wrong. So Shun, what he did was that he took all this information and processed it, evaluated the information, and he would only take the ideas and examples and promote ideas and examples that would encourage kind thoughts and behavior in others, in the people. So this is this idea of accentuating the good over the bad. Now, this is not to say that we ignore the wrong, the bad, or we try to cover it up, nor is it about not knowing the difference between good and bad. This is simply about being very cautious and wary about the impact of negative examples. And it's about being careful not to shine a spotlight on negative examples. Why is that? Well, because some people may learn and emulate these examples. Some people might be curious and want to try it out. So in talking and promoting these examples of others or ideas, we have to be very clear about what we're bringing out and the lessons that we draw from it, particularly through education. But this particular point also relates to accentuating the positives and the strengths in others. And this great saying, another common saying in Chinese, which is to praise in public and criticize in private. So obviously we praise others in front of others because it means that not only do they feel encouraged to keep up the good work, but people around who hear that may realize that this is something that's really good to emulate, and they'll learn from that good example too. Now, on the other hand, if we decide to criticize in public, and not only will that embarrass the person, but they'll get angry. And when they feel embarrassed and annoyed, it sort of stops them from really taking in what we're trying to say and accepting our feedback. On top of that, not only will they not take our advice, but they'll end up resenting us. So that's why it's important to criticize in private. Now, even when we criticize in private, we have to do so on a particular basis. So we have to have a level of trust between us and the other person, that they have to be confident in what we say. So if we don't have that, then often the other person feels that we might be overly critical or too demanding, and so it won't work either. So being able to accentuate the positive is to really focus on the strengths of others. And it's very interesting that Confucius particularly talked about this. Why? Because it's actually not something that's very easy to do. It might be easy to compliment someone we like, someone who's kind to us, someone we agree with. But it's very difficult to maybe compliment someone who disagrees with us and gives us a hard time. So Shun was able to find the strengths in everyone. And this goes back to what we were saying before in the early parts of Practice of the Mean and in the highest learning, that everyone has this enlightened virtue. Everyone has this innate nature, this potential for utmost goodness. And it's simply a matter of uncovering it. It's just like the way that's present in everything and everyone. And it's a matter of really focusing on it to find the strengths in others. So if we can do that, then we can really encourage others to continue developing and cultivating their virtue. But more importantly, this actually benefits us. By focusing on the positives of others, we're actually learning from their strengths. On the other hand, if we focus on their faults, not only do we not learn from their strengths, but we end up indulging in our own emotions of complaining about them and, feeling angry and resentful towards them. So by actually focusing and looking for their strengths, then in fact we are actually not only helping them, but helping ourselves uncover our own virtue within. So that's one of the great things about this, is it's actually a win-win situation. And then the fourth strategy is that he would grasp these two ends and use the mean in relation to the people. So grasp means to evaluate or understand, two ends refers to two extremes. So the two extremes are not enough or too much. It's like this photo here. You know, when we're baking a cake or some muffins, you don't want to over bake it because it'll be burnt, and you don't want to undercook it either. Either way, you can't really eat it. You have to get it just right, like the photo here. So this is in relation to cooking or you know, how we handle things, making sure that it's just right. And that's this so-called mean. Now, this mean is not a sort of mathematical average between two endpoints. And it's not trying to find a consensus view or common ground between, you know, different people who might be disagreeing on opposite ends of a spectrum. Because if we do that, then that really depends on whose opinion is being expressed and how we find that common ground. Rather, the mean here refers to the way, which is a solution that is achieved that allows all things, all people to flourish and be in harmony. So this is finding the right solution, the right time for the right person, and so that everyone is able to benefit. And this standard goes back to the way, rather than finding, you know, simply a consensus view. Now, this is all sounding quite abstract, so what I did was to draw out a few examples from the deeds of way so that we can think of it on a more specific level. So first here it states, it is good to praise the virtuous actions of others, knowing that they are being praised. People will be encouraged to do better. Now this is exactly what we were saying before about accentuating the positives in others, right? So what then are the two extremes? Well, first we could go overboard and praise them for something that they haven't done. Or we could overgeneralize and just say, oh, you know, they're so great, you know, they're just perfect. When that doesn't help them at all, particularly when it comes to children. You have to be very specific about what we praise them for, the specific action, so that they know what they should continue to do and what they should stop doing. So this also works for adults to, you know, be clear and specific about what you're praising them for, so that they know that to continue down the right track. Now that's one extreme, is to praise them to go overboard and praise. The other extreme is to not provide any praise or encouragement. And so this person could be, you know, doing these great things, but you just don't acknowledge them and don't acknowledge it at all. And obviously then they might feel deflated. They might not be encouraged to continue. So that's the two extremes that we want to avoid. Then there's this particular instruction which says that when meeting elders whom we know, greet them promptly and respectfully. And if they do not greet us in return, respectfully stand aside. Now this seems fine if it was a normal road, but let's look at the photo here. It's a busy multi-lane road. And imagine if you're on one side of the street and you see someone, the elder that you recognize on the other side of the street. Does that mean that you have to run across the road and greet them promptly? Obviously not. So this would be going overboard in the sense that you're sticking to the letter of the book, regardless of your own safety. Now, you know, on a busy road like this, if it happens to be at a pedestrian crossing, if it happens to be a red light and you're able to cross, then that would be great. But if it threatens your safety of people around you, then we have to think again. And so there are actually exceptions to these rules where you have to think about the common good here and not just about adhering rigidly to these instructions. So that would be one extreme. The other extreme is if you walk past this person, this elder that you know, and you don't even acknowledge them, you don't even greet them. So that would be the other extreme. And so this particular instruction provides us with the right thing to do. You know, when we meet them in a safe distance and a safe place, then yes, it's important to greet them promptly and respectfully, etc. And finally, this example is taken from the last chapter, and it talks about this idea of having a balance between our knowledge and practice. So it says, if we acquire knowledge, but do not sincerely apply what we have learned, we'll have only increased our conceit. Then what then will we become? If we are sincere in what we are doing, but not acquiring knowledge, we will only be stubbornly following our viewpoints, and we will never see the truth. So the first sentence is about a kind of book learning. So, studying intensively in terms of these texts, but not really thinking about how you can live it in your everyday life. Now, the other extreme then is actually not looking at the text at all and, being very diligent in our practice, but not checking back on whether we have actually adhered to the right standards and really just going off on our own opinions. So that's really two extremes here in this idea of practicing. So practice versus knowledge has to be in good balance. So hopefully through these examples, you would have gained a bit more of an understanding of what we mean by the two ends or the two extremes. And so just to recap, the great wisdom that King Shun manifested was developed through his ability to ask questions. He loved to ask questions. He loved to examine these common sayings, not letting them slip by without fully appreciating their value. He was able to accentuate the good and the strengths in others instead of the bad. And he was able to be aware of two extremes and find a balance. In other words, use the mean for the benefit of his people. And this was what made him Shun. Now, when I read this, I was reminded, in fact, of another passage that occurs in the second half of the practice of the mean, which I'd like to talk briefly about now, because the second half of the text deals with this idea of sincerity. And sincerity, or in Chinese, cheng, is really another way of talking about the mean or the innate nature. And so it still focuses very much on the same thing, even though different terminology is used. So this idea of studying and this whole process of learning about one's innate nature and this sincerity is covered by this particular passage. So it says here from the doctrine of the practice of the mean, extensively study it. So this it is the sincerity, or you could call it the mean. Judiciously inquire about it, carefully think about it, be clear about its distinctions, and sincerely practice it. So extensively study obviously refers to this idea of book learning. So, in our classics, when we read these texts, we have to really delve deep into them. If there are any parts we don't understand, we should ask questions about it and be clear. And then when we are told the answers, we should be thinking very carefully about what it means and be clear about, what it's telling us to do before we can actually practice it. Now, does that sort of have parallels in what we just talked about? I think this chart will help make things clearer. So extensively study it, judiciously inquire about, and this is the idea of asking questions. Then Shun examined what he had heard, the answers that he was given, and this is the step of carefully thinking about it. Then he would be able to distinguish between what's right and wrong, good or bad, which is being clear about its distinctions, and then ultimately was able to practice it by using the mean for his people. So you can see here, there are steps to the whole process, and it's very well illustrated by our exemplar here, King Shun. So we can certainly learn from King Shun and do what he does even today. Now, not everyone is like King Shun though, and I'm sure through our own cultivation we would have sort of run into challenges. And this is possibly what the next passage is about. So it says here, the Confucius said, everyone says, I'm wise, but drive them on and catch them in various nets, traps, or pits, and they do not know how to escape. All say, I'm wise, yet if they choose the practice of the mean, they cannot sustain it for a whole month. So it's very interesting how this particular passage is juxtaposed with the great wisdom of Shun. Here, people think they're wise, but actually they're not. And what are the differences between these two passages? Well, because these people think they're wise, they don't bother asking questions, they don't bother to examine the answers or the familiar sayings, and therefore they can't practice the mean. So what happens is they get caught in various traps. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a trap before, but what's the characteristic element of a trap? It's the bait, isn't it? So, there's a bait like food that lures the animal, and the trap seems quite harmless. Now, this is the same with what it's talking about here in terms of humans. The bait could be money, could be fame, profit, etc. And these people are driven by their self-interests, their selfish desires. And because they are completely consumed by these selfish desires, they're not able to detect their thoughts and perfect their knowledge and not be a slave to these emotions. And what happens is that ultimately they encounter misfortune, which is the trap, and they can't escape these negative consequences. So it goes back to what we were saying before about how if they were truly wise, they would examine sort of familiar sayings like, you reap what you sow. And they would realize that everything they do now has a consequence. So it's not about simply enjoying, ill-gotten gains or undeserved gains temporarily. It's not to take these gains and not to accept these gains in the first place, because there's only going to be painful consequences later. So this is this idea of how people think they know, but really they don't. And because of that, the lack of knowledge leads them to lack practice. So they goes hand in hand, this knowledge and practice. So it says here they cannot sustain the practice of the mean for a month. Now, that's not to say that it can't be done. And therefore, the compiler of this text was very quick to reassure us that, yes, it can be done by providing us with another exemplar. So this is the next passage. Confucius said, Hui was one who chose the practice of the mean. If he acquired one virtue, then he took it in, held it fast within his heart, and did not lose it. So Yan Hui refers to a student of Confucius, someone who is considered the best student of Confucius. He was actually 30 years younger than Confucius, but unfortunately passed away at the tender age of 31. So he passed away even before his teacher died. But we know a lot about him because Confucius praises him extensively in these classic texts. So I've extracted two passages from the Analects, and you can see that this virtue that he holds on to is further elaborated in this top passage, in which Confucius praises Yan Hui for, going 3 months without ever departing from humanity, sort of keeping humanity, this innate moral quality, at the forefront of his mind. Whereas other students could only do so for 1 day or at the most 1 month. Now, obviously, Yan Hui could do this for a prolonged period of time, and I'm sure some commentators have actually said that it wasn't necessarily 3 months exactly, but possibly because Confucius was observing him for 3 months. But he could do so for a sustained period. And this humanity is about sort of seeing others and all things as oneself, this kind of oneness. And that is exactly this idea of cultivating the way. So humanity is obviously something that is an innate moral quality, but we need to bring it out. And for Yan-Hui, he could do so. How is this manifested in his actual words and actions? Well, it says here in the next passage that his love of learning meant that he was able to practice, but manifestation of this learning was that he never escalated his anger. So what does that mean? It means that if he felt a tinge of annoyance or anger, then he would be able to immediately detect it and then perfect his knowledge and change that, so that it didn't escalate to the point of, offending people with his words and actions. Angry conduct. And then on top of that, he never repeated his mistakes. So as you can see that, this practice of the mean, sustaining this virtue, has benefits. Not only will you achieve sort of harmony within, but also a harmony without, in the sense that you're able to interact better with people around you. As we heard from the highest learning, within your family first, and then ultimately the community. So we see this very clearly in the example of Yan-Hui. Now, this, love of learning, this ability to sustain the practice of the mean, this is something that requires a dedication, tenacity, inner strength. And that's what the next two passages are about, this strength that's required for the practice of the mean. So here, Confucius said, the kingdom, the states, and the families can be at peace, rank and salary can be declined, and naked blades can be trampled upon, yet the practice of the mean may not be possible. So what is it referring to here? Firstly, the kingdom refers to the jurisdiction of the Son of Heaven, so the Chinese kingdom, versus the states ruled over by hereditary lords, and family clans ruled by ministers and high officials. So at all of these levels of governance or organizations of people, effective governance can be achieved. So it says here that people can be at peace and in peace and harmony. And this obviously requires a certain level of competence and strength on the part of the leader. But is this the strength that is required of the practice of the mean? Let's read on. Continues by saying that rank and salary can be declined. So someone could have the strength to resist temptation, high office and a generous salary, particularly if it's in a government that they disapprove of. So a government run by a tyrannical or autocratic ruler. So someone like Confucius, who actually resigned from his job at the State of Law and then journeyed to the various states and also declined positions there. So this requires a sense of another level of strength. And then finally, this kind of bold courage is needed and fortitude to be able to step on sharp blades and, have this courage in the face of a life-threatening situation. So you can see that in this passage, Confucius works us up to a point where you can see, well, all of these things are very challenging. Effective governance, declining, resisting temptation, stepping on naked blades, sharp blades. But despite all of these challenges, if we could achieve all of the above, it says that the practice of the mean may still not be possible. So, it's telling us that the practice of the mean involves something more than this. It's more than just sort of the intellectual skills or people skills involved in government. It's more than just willpower or bold courage. But it doesn't tell us exactly what else is required. It just makes us think. Now, the next passage, in fact, is much more explicit in telling us what this practice of the mean is about in terms of inner strength. It's a conversation. This next passage is a conversation between Confucius and his student Zilu. And Zilu asks about strength. Confucius says, do you mean the strength of the southern region? Do you mean the strength of the northern region? Or do you mean your type of strength? To be tolerant and mild in teaching others, and not to exact retribution against those without the way is the strength of the southern region. Exemplary persons live by this. To lie down to sleep with weapons and armor and to die without regret is the strength of the northern region, and strong men live by this. So Zilu is a very prominent student of Confucius. He's was actually quite senior, only 9 years younger than Confucius. And that's why in various texts we see that he's actually very direct. And that's actually his personality. He's very forthright, has this valor, sense of justice, and is very quick to act. So when he's asking about strength, he's actually asking for Confucius to praise him and acknowledge that, he's the kind of person who has the strength. And his strength is more of a bold sort of physical strength. Now, Confucius knows his students inside out. And as you can see, that he tailors his teaching. So rather than refuting Zilu outright, he begins with a series of rhetorical questions to get Zilu to really think and reflect about the scope of this idea of strength. So, southern region, northern region, or the strength of the Central Plains where Zilu comes from. Now, when he does this, of course, he's also sort of using these very interesting stereotypes. So even to this day, people in China will have stereotypical notions about people who come from the south or from the north. And this is related to the climate, the terrain, and more importantly, the temperament of people from these two different regions. And it's interesting because even in Confucius's time, these stereotypes were present. So he's sort of using these stereotypes to get the message across to Zilu that there's sort of two extremes here. So first begins with the Southerners, whom he says has a very accommodating and lenient attitude. They're very forgiving. So, even if you offend them, they won't seek revenge. And so this is a kind of inner strength, isn't it? That exemplary persons would live by. But you can also tell from the tone of his voice that it's not necessarily something that Confucius would approve of, that there's something missing here. Because if you're too lenient, then people could take advantage of you or exploit you. So strength is more than this. And then he talks about the strength of the northern region. And it's a kind of brute strength, isn't it? That they are ready to have this hand-to-hand combat and fight at any time. So they even sleep with their weapons and their armor on. And they're also ready to die at any time without even any regret. So this sort of might be in keeping with what Zilu is thinking about, really. And Confucius is very clear. He says strong men live by this, but certainly not the exemplary persons. So this is really the other extreme, isn't it? This sort of physical aggression versus a kind of tolerance and leniency. And finally, we're told the answer, which is, what Confucius thinks is strength, the strength that's required for the practice of the mean. He says, the exemplary person is in harmony and does not waver. How strong is their resolve? They establish the mean and do not deviate. How strong is their resolve? If the state possesses the way, they are unchanging in genuineness. How strong is their resolve? If the state does not possess the way, they are unchanging in the face of death. How strong is their resolve? So there's a lot of repetition here, I think you can realize. And that's because Confucius is trying to reiterate that this is the strength that he's talking about. This is the resolve that's needed. So the exemplary person is in harmony, but this harmony is not one that, is about keeping on good terms with everyone and making sure that, you don't offend people. This harmony is actually about being in harmony with one's innate nature, with the way, with the mean, or you could also call it the ultimate reality. So that's the harmony. And because this harmony is rooted in something that's objective rather than the subjective opinions of others, then does not waver. In other words, you don't just go with the flow of what others are doing. You have your standard, which you you adhere to. That's the harmony with one's enlightened virtue, this way, or mean. And they are able to establish the mean, they're able to cultivate it without deviating. So there's this constancy in their practice. Now, specifically, Confucius provides us with two circumstances. So first is if the state possesses the way. In other words, the government of the times is led by a virtuous leader, someone who's cultivating themselves. Now, obviously, the exemplary person would serve in this government. They would be recognized, and they might even be given high office and a generous salary. Now, despite these trappings of success, they would still remain genuine and not simply pander to their leader to retain their office. So they would be unchanging in their ideals. The other scenario is if the state does not possess the way, that the state is led by a non-virtuous leader, and this leader is only thinking about enjoying themselves, and they're surrounded by sycophants who tell them how good they are. Then in this case, the exemplary person would not be serving and would probably try their best to help improve the situation. It could involve remonstrating, and even to the point of facing death, because other people would dislike them and wouldn't want them around. So even despite the threat of death, they would remain unchanged. So you can see, of course, that the exemplary person uses both the strength of the Northerners and the Southerners in some ways, in the sense that they're not afraid of death like the Northerners, and they're also able to be accommodating like the Southerners, but it's more than that. It's actually establishing standards in relation to being in harmony with the way, or one's innate nature, the principles that we read about in these texts. So having that particular standard and not changing from that. So this particular passage was about courage or strength. And so in conclusion, and to recap, the various passages today bring out different qualities that we need on our journey as we practice the mean. The first is wisdom. We need to develop and bring out our innate wisdom using the 4 strategies that Xun exemplified. Asking questions, examining familiar words, accentuating the good, and using the mean. Not sort of going to 2 extremes. And then we also need this humanity, to bring out our humanity, like Yanhui, that this wisdom, this knowledge is not about ourselves, it's actually about benefiting others. And then in order to keep at it, to be constant, we need to have this courage or this innate strength, you might call it, to not waver despite what others say, what others do. And so the second section up to this point is not only tells us some of the pitfalls and how we can practice the mean, but also what are some of the qualities we need to work on, we need to really recognize and develop. And it's also given us really good strategies that we can use even to today. So that's all that I'll cover today in terms of this particular section. And in next week, we'll skip to another part of the text, which also focuses on the practice of the mean, but at a broader level in terms of management, in terms of government. So we'll temporarily leave aside this idea of the individual cultivation and think about its broader implications in terms of the practice of the mean. But I'll leave you with a thought of developing your wisdom, humanity, and your courage in the practice of the mean. Thank you very much for listening.